Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and welcome. I'm Ed McCann, the founder of Read 650, and your host for today's special Ancestry event entitled Who, Me? We're delighted to return once again to City Winery's beautiful flagship location here in New York City. And as many of you know, Read 650 takes its name from the maximum word count of the personal stories we present on our stage and in our bi-weekly podcast. 650 words translates to a 5-minute spoken word performance. That is just 2 double-spaced pages, and wait until you hear what these talented writers can accomplish in that tight frame. Thanks for joining us this afternoon to support good writing and the spoken word. It has been said that genealogy is where you confuse the dead and irritate the living. And my own slow-motion, on-again, off-again, decades-long exploration of the family tree has been illuminating and rewarding in ways that I could never have imagined. And as a young man in the dark ages before Ancestry.com, I began collecting names and dates to add to boxes in a chart. And I wrote actual letters to the Bureau of Vital Statistics and included $16 checks requesting research assistance or copies of birth and marriage and death certificates. And I never imagined that my search would enrich my personal and professional life in the profound ways that it has. I hadn't anticipated the meaningful family connections that would follow. And literally, they physically took me from Maine to California with stops in Massachusetts and Connecticut, as well as several trips to Ireland. And I have a cousin here in the house that I didn't grow up with, who is a very rich part of my life that I didn't meet until I was in my mid-30s, last week. It opened a world and welcoming a family I wouldn't otherwise have known. And these days, if you're inclined, it is much easier and faster to get started filling in the gaps of your family story. And what you may learn may also change the way that you view yourself. Now, it's possible you already know a lot about your genetic and behavioral ingredients that went into the package that became you, much like you will now hear from our first writer, Levin, who opens the show. Anne is a writer, she's a book reviewer, and a recovering journalist whose work has been featured in newspapers, magazines, and websites around the world. And during a long career at the Associated Press, Anne coordinated coverage of elections in the 50 states and every imaginable kind of natural and human disaster. And one of her favorite stories ever was the airlift of bighorn sheep from a state park near San Diego. Although she now lives on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, she grew up in Western Pennsylvania. She went to a Quaker boarding school outside Philadelphia, and she graduated from all-women's Smith College and studied writing, barbecue, and beer at the University of Texas. And those are experiences that continue to inform her work today. Anne is a frequent contributor to Read 650, and she returns to our stage today to read Besieged by My Jeans. Please say hello to Anne Levin.
The slight twist in my nose, which my older brother had too, comes from my grandma Jessie. The overall shape of my face and sometime far away look in my eye, that's from my Aunt Frances. Both of these women suffered from severe mental illness for most of their lives, and I've spent most of mine wondering if and when it would happen to me. My parents weren't exactly reassuring on the subject of nature versus nurture, heredity versus environment. If anything, they came down firmly on the side of genes. People never change, my dad used to tell us. You're stuck with your genetic package. That meant if my younger brother slouched at the dinner table, he was like Grandpa. If my older sister sang off key, she was Aunt Fanny. And if I got worked up about the war in Vietnam, well then, wasn't I the epitome of Frances? She loved FDR so much, Dad said, shaking his head ruefully. It just wasn't normal. I got the message. I wasn't either. And I'd better be careful about my forceful views. Even after I'd made it to my early 40s and had a good job, nice apartment, and great partner, I still felt haunted by the specter of Grandma's lobotomy, terrified of Frances's mangled arm, which was broken beyond repair when she stuck it into a washing machine during the spin cycle. No matter how good my life was in the moment, I always felt like a nervous breakdown was right around the corner. As one of my cousins once told me, mental illness is quite prominent in this family. When I started to see a therapist, she was stunned that I spoke so often in the first person plural. We Levins don't do that kind of thing, I'd tell her. Or, that's not a Levin thing to do. And I was stunned when she suggested that many of the things that I thought were hardwired in my genes might very well have been learned. For instance, the way I noticed how much everyone weighed. Wasn't it possible, she said, that you picked that up from your mother, who not only did it, but could calculate yours and your sister's within a 1-pound margin of error? Or my fear of riding in fast cars. Wasn't it possible, she said, that it came from sitting behind your dad on countless road trips when you were young, hearing him shout at your mother, "Sally, you're driving the machine too fast," when she went over 40. One day, the therapist made another stunning observation. The fact that I sometimes felt sad wasn't necessarily genetic proof that I was psychotic. If you learn a behavior, she said calmly, then you can unlearn it. Well, okay. But even if I could train myself not to clutch the armrests when my husband drove the speed limit on the LIE, there were a lot of other things that ran in the family that I simply couldn't unlearn, like cancer, arthritis, glaucoma, insomnia, constipation, high cholesterol, and an allergy to kiwis. The whole genetic package. The other day, I typed genetic package into the internet to see what it came up with, and it took me to a series of articles about packaged cake mix. Turns out there were lots of different ways to make it better. You could replace the water with ginger ale for a bright yellow look, amp up the flavor with extra vanilla or rum, add instant pudding for a dense, moisture texture, hide chocolate ganache or whipped cream between the layers, bake it in a bundt pan, turn it into cupcakes, adorn it with spun sugar flowers, sprinkle the top with M&Ms. As with the cake mix, I thought, so it might be with myself. Everything in the package came from my parents, but I could always jazz it up with a little ginger ale.
Jai Chakrabarti is originally from Calcutta, India, and he now lives in the Hudson Valley, where he enjoys playing chess with his 7-year-old son. Jai spent his 20s writing poetry before he switched over to prose, both fiction and nonfiction. He is widely published in places as diverse as Plowshares, One Story, and the Wall Street Journal. His novel, From Penguin Random House, A Play for the End of the World, appears on the PEN/Faulkner longlist and won the National Jewish Book Award for debut fiction. He's a Pushcart Prize winner who's performed on selected shorts and Symphony Space. And next month, Knopf will bring out his story collection, A Small Sacrifice for an Enormous Happiness. In Giving Water, the story he presents today, Jai describes how two ancestral traditions, his and his wife's, blend together in the next generation. Please welcome Jai Chakrabarti.
Every year in the autumn, my mother texts me to announce it's time to perform the Torpon ceremony. The text is precipitated by my father, who's most inclined to track when rituals of note fall on the calendar, but he's less inclined to partake in technology like texting. So it's left to my mother to relay the Sanskrit mantras, and for me to then recite the prayers and to give my ancestors water by cupping a little in my hands, then drinking it myself in the morning before I eat, so that no one in my long line will go thirsty. I'm told I'm from a long line of philosophers, which continued with my parents, but ended with me when I became a writer. I'm told my last name was an honorific given by a king as a sign of patronage. We come from a country that's still defined in many ways by castes, and my ancestors, the Brahmins, came not from royalty, but from those who were well treated by the rich, a situation that in post-colonial India allowed them to flourish in the New World as lawyers, engineers, moneymakers. My religious sentiments have diminished with age, but in my birth country, the far-right Hindutva groups have gained prominence. Emboldened by politicians in power, India has mainstreamed a version of Hinduism that lionizes its saints without interrogating the history of casteism and religious violence. In America, through one lens, I'm seen as a minority, but in India, my ancestors weren't the minority, at least not in their influence, and I'm left to wrestle with their ghosts. All of this came to the fore when my wife, Ilana, was pregnant and we discussed our future son's last name. Ilana is Jewish, the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and it was important that her family name be preserved. My father was equally adamant that his grandson carry on the Chakrabarti name. This was vital for many reasons, he said, not the least of which had to do with water. In the Tarpon ceremony, you name your grandparents, great-grandparents, and as you ask for their blessing, you make sure they're not thirsty in their afterlives by giving them water. There's a sweetness to the ritual that reminds me of my boyhood on boats in the Ganges, the river imbued with holiness despite the traffic and the refuse and the stink, the sunset making the surface of the water shimmer as it must have for millennia. Technically, this ritual can only be performed by those who bear their ancestors' last name. It's in the rules of the game, codified in Hindu scripture. Move on from your tribe, and you risk leaving your great-grandparents parched. But the love that Ilana and I have found infuses two cultures and religions. It's interfaith in the sense of the word, that it's inside the faiths, allowing us to bring light from each of our traditions as we make our shared home. For both of us, this means embracing the truths that aren't so narrow. So we decided to hyphenate. A child with a forever long name. When my mother learned of our decision, she tried to sway us in every way. She said other students would laugh at our son's name, thinking it too long. But from attending middle school in America, I knew that it wasn't Ilana's last name that would be a problem. Hers is 4 letters. It would be mine. If his name were the subject of a playground taunt, it would be because of my inheritance. None of this stops me from dutifully giving water to my ancestors every year, though I know the tradition ends with me. This is in part because my son doesn't have my father's family name, which excludes him in the scriptural, technical sense. But there's also the reality that I am unlikely to remind him of important dates and mantras with the patience and rigor my parents have followed. Sometimes I grieve the loss of this ritual, the end of a line. Other times, I'm hopeful that whatever practice my son may adopt, as one day he mourns me, will be wise and beautiful.
Judy C. Andrews is a proud 2-degree graduate of the City College of New York with a bachelor's in liberal arts and her master's in English and creative writing. She has written, among other works, 2 suspense thrillers and a collection of poetry entitled The Gathering of Gemstones. Judy has also worked as an educator, a freelance writer, and editor. She frequently explores social issues in her writing, and her favorite topics include foster care, education, history, and Gullah Geechee culture. When she's not writing, Judy enjoys cooking, sightseeing, and long walks in warm rain. The story Judy shares today illuminates the power of a name and how it can unlock long-hidden family secrets. Here to read Yucky, please welcome Judy Andrews.
My father, Walter Underwood, called me Yucky for most of my life and for most of my childhood. Although the name itself might sound yucky, when my father referred to me this way, he was always kind, gentle, and loving. Yeah, Yucky, that done on with that seed potato. Come by here, Yucky, and taught me some cane. Mwah. After a bowl of delicious rice cereal drowned in butter, sugar, molasses, and syrup, he'd say, "Eat that up to the hatch, Yucky?" Yes, was the answer to everything he asked me, because he was my father and I loved him. It never occurred to me to ask my parents why he called me Yucky. He passed away at age 81 when I was 15 years old. But I still remember many distinct conversations we had when I was a child, even those before he brought me to St. Barnabas' home on Mulberry Street in Lower Manhattan, where I spent ages 7 to 9. Some family history would help here. My parents had a stormy relationship. I was placed in the group home at age 7 because my father had learned that my mother had tried to hurt me in order to hurt him for not marrying her. After St. Barnabas, I spent ages 10 to 21 in foster care. My mother, Catherine Andrews, died when I was 22 due to complications related to diabetes. She was from Savannah, Georgia. I was her only child, and from ages 10 to the day of my mother's death, I spent every holiday at the hospital with my mother because of her health issues and chronic depression. At my mother's funeral, I met a bougie aunt, now deceased, who lived in a mansion in Georgia. She explained that my father was Geechee. My parents never discussed their relatives with me, but hearing that word for the first time, that led me on a journey into my own history. I found that since the 1870s, the Gullah Geechee people have lived on more than 1,000 islands off the coasts of Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Gullah is a pidgin language derived from people of 17 African countries during the African American slave trade. It allowed enslaved people to communicate with each other. Geechee is a mixture of Pidgin, Creole, and English. And it is spoken throughout the surrounding areas around the Ogeechee rivers and in Georgia. In the month after that funeral, I discovered more about myself than I had ever known throughout my life. My mother had constant trauma in her family. She had 2 sisters and 1 brother. Their parents died within 1 year of each other. My maternal grandmother was killed in an automobile accident when my mother was only 17. After living with their grandparents, each child left Georgia to live in the North during the Great Migration. I learned that my father was born in Virginia. His maternal grandfather, Richard Trueheart, was a member of the United States Colored Troops during the American Civil War, and he was given an honorary military burial in 1880. His remains are in the Arlington National Cemetery. My father had been a soldier in World War I and World War II. He has a huge family throughout Virginia and New Jersey. Gullah Geechee is the only language my father ever spoke to me. Until that time, I had never known anything about the Gullah Geechee people or the Great Migration or my family history. I lived in terrible foster homes. I did not fit any of the social statistics regarding foster children. I felt like an outsider with no connection to my roots. But a foundation of love from my parents had been set for me at an early age. And at age 22, I finally learned about why my father called me Yucky. It is the Gullah name for Judy.
Native New Yorker Jack O'Connell lives on Long Island with his wife Margaret, and he knows how lucky he is to be not only an actor by profession and choice, but also a working actor with dozens of credits. You may recognize him from his roles in film and TV, among them Doubt, Big Night, Inside Llewyn Davis, Mad Men, Nurse Jackie, Vinyl, and The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. He recently had a guest starring role in the new Netflix hit Kaleidoscope as Jerry the Pawnbroker, and he's making the festival rounds in La Locuta, a series focused on Alzheimer's. In the story Jack shares today, Everyone Likes Him, he describes a role that may well turn out to be his most important and his most consequential. Please give a very warm welcome back to our stage to Jack O'Connell.
My brother spends hours on his desktop, following the stock market or studying his family stock through genealogy resources. He'll call me up from time to time with useless information, sometimes interesting facts regarding our family heritage. Hi, do you know you're 2% Iberian? And 1% Scandinavian? No, I didn't know that. Hi, do you know that Mommy's family spoke Russian, Lithuanian, and Polish, but only Polish in the home? No, I didn't know that either. Then one evening in the summer of 2019, he hit the jackpot. The call was to tell me that a second cousin near Buffalo, New York, who was also on his genealogy site, came up with some interesting information. Our cousin Jillian received a hit from a 47-year-old male in New Jersey who found out recently that he was adopted and was searching for his birth parents. Having already discovered who his mother was, he was now looking for his father. So, his DNA matched our cousin in Buffalo and also someone on Long Island who he assumed would be my brother. Knowing it wasn't him, though, my brother would then call me with news that I've been somewhat expecting for quite some time. Yes, it was me. I had an extramarital love affair in the early 1970s and fathered a son who was put up for adoption through Catholic Charities in Brooklyn, New York. His name is Kevin, and he was never told that he was adopted because his adoptive parents were over 40 at the time, which was against the rules in 1972. Hence, a fear of having to return him if found out. Kevin grew up without relatives. No siblings, no cousins, no aunts, no uncles. But his family tree would bloom that summer after his DNA connected us, and we would soon arrange to meet. He and his wife, Jen, pulled up in front of my house where I was waiting outside, a sizable head looming above the steering wheel. He got out of the car. I saw his mother and his face. We hugged rather awkwardly and proceeded up the walk to my front door. His wife, Jen, stopped and grabbed my arm and looked at me to reassure me. Everybody likes him. It was my unbridled, heady days of youth that would hurt many people. Some would never heal. But here was a time to make some good come out of it. Not only would he find his father, but also his stepmother, 4 half-brothers, 4 half-sisters, who would all show up at a reveal party that summer. Before this introduction, I had to explain individually to each child the circumstances. But here now was a wonderful evening, with Kevin sitting at our dining room table. My son Liam, an experienced rapper, wrote a song with a rap that would introduce each sibling. Then as we passed the champagne around the table, Kevin and his siblings shared medical histories that came from his newly discovered genes and answered questions about music, sports, hobbies, food, and drink favorites. Since then, we try to get together for holidays and summertime destinations, as well as weekly FaceTime conversations. During the pandemic, we had Tuesday night trivia through Zoom, with the winner's job to make up the questions for the following week. Sometimes I find myself auditioning for Father Knows Best or Cool Cat Musically Hip Daddy-O. Not necessary, says Kevin. It has been a wonderful couple of years. My wife and I seem to find a new energy that we embrace wholeheartedly. And Kevin's wife, Jen, was right. Everyone likes him. And his adoptive parents, Joan and Wally, and of course his birth mother, Kathy W.
Charles R. Hale wears many hats: cultural and music historian, filmmaker, college lecturer, producer, and of course, writer. All of these feed his keen enthusiasm for New York City, where he was born, raised, and educated. Charles also co-founded Artists Without Walls, an organization dedicated to cultural collaboration and artistic achievement that offers monthly performance salons. His work highlighting New York's rich artistic diversity has also been performed at museums, historical societies, and colleges throughout the city. A proud descendant of Irish famine immigrants, Charles was honored by the City University of New York for outstanding service to New York and Irish America. In his essay, Remembrance and Redemption, Charles describes how he honored the memory of a relative he never met, giving his family the closure that had eluded them for generations. It is my pleasure to present to you Charles Hale.
It was quiet, too quiet. He rose from his bed and walked to the baby's crib. Her wraps were soaked in blood. He called the doctor who delivered the baby, but it was too late. The baby had bled to death. She was 7 hours old. The young father walked to the Catholic Church to arrange the baby's funeral service. The priest explained to him that the baby could not have a Catholic funeral service or be buried at the family plot at nearby Calvary Cemetery. She hadn't been baptized. The baby was embodied with a hereditary stain, original sin, which could no longer be cleansed from her soul. Across the timeless landscape of the forgotten, in New York's Catholic cemeteries, my family lay scattered, all but one, a 7-hour-old baby. 80 years later, we were Catholic in name only. Unlike my friends' homes, where signs of their Catholicism were often on display, a cross or a picture of the Lord, religion was not discussed. My sisters and I were never pressured into pursuing Catholicism when we were young. Why? I asked my mother, "Where is your baby sister buried?" "I don't know," she said. "Did she have a name?" "She must have." "How could your mother and father ever attend a Catholic service again?" "Except for weddings, they didn't. Your grandmother once said, 'I see gangsters go by in big funeral processions, and I think, how can these bums be buried in a Catholic cemetery, but they can't bury a little baby because she was with original sin?' So I asked my mother, how much of her disinterest and distrust of religion came from learning that the church refused to bury her sister and unbaptized child in consecrated ground. "Need you ask?" she said. I visited New York's municipal archives. I located the death certificate. Florence Gorman, she was named after her mother, my grandmother, died at 6 a.m. on October 1st, 1924. The document indicates where the baby is buried, Mount Olivet, a non-sectarian cemetery in Maspeth, Queens. I drove to the cemetery. A clerk sifted through a large black journal. He found Florence's name. She was buried along with 6 infants who were either stillborn or who died immediately after birth. The 2 of us drove to her burial site. "She's somewhere out there," the clerk said, of a desolate field covered by weeds and uncut grass. Proscribed for eternity, Florence was forever separated from her family. Could I confer meaning and dignity to Florence's life? I visited my grandparents' grave at St. John's Cemetery in Queens and looked at the headstone. There was room for Florence's name. I documented the familial relationship between my grandmother, mother, and me, and received permission to add Florence's name to the gravestone. I visited a monument company and arranged for Florence's name to be etched into the stone. 5 weeks later, the work was completed. I returned to Mount Olivet. A veil of morning mist covered the cemetery. I made my way to the site where Florence was buried. I scooped up some moist dirt and poured it into a plastic bag. I thought of the Catholic tenet, largely written and developed in the 4th and 5th centuries by Augustine of Hippo, a Catholic saint, renowned scholar and theologian. He wrote, "Even if there were men in nothing but original sin, it would be sufficient for their condemnation." Those words determined Florence's fate. When I returned to St. John's Cemetery, I strode to the spot where my grandparents are buried. I sprinkled the moist dirt over their grave. I leaned over and touched Florence's name, etched in stone beneath her parents' names for eternity.
Rhonda Zangwill has been flitting around the edges of the literary life since her first post-college gig at a famous publishing house. And when she inadvertently ruffled the wrong feathers, their resident poet had her fired for insubordination. Undaunted, she vowed evermore to avoid egomaniacs and instead found like-minded comrades at such places as Teachers and Writers Collaborative, Girls Right Now, that's right with a W, right now, the Penn Prison Program, and The Moth. These days, she runs writing workshops with the New York Writers Coalition and the Sirovich Senior Center. She's grateful for a family full of oddballs, cranks, and crusaders whose barely disguised idiosyncrasies somehow find their way into her work. Today, Rhonda enlarges her family tree rather expansively in her essay, Out on a Limb. Please welcome back to our stage, Rhonda Zangwill.
Long before 23andMe became a thing, I had my own Ancestry hotline, my father's library. It was crowded with books by the writer Israel Zangwill, the forebear he claimed, as did his father before him. Maybe you know some of the titles: Children of the Ghetto, The King of Schnorrers, The Melting Pot. Yes, that very same pot that all of us bubble in every day. Well, it was Israel Zangwill, a British Jew, who coined that phrase on an American literary tour in 1908. He took one look at our huddled masses and transformed all of us into an enduring metaphor. What a claim to fame, and one that has, over the years, compelled complete strangers to squeal in delight upon learning my name. Zangwill? Are you related to Izzy? I love him. Once a postal clerk gave me a big grin, tapped his yarmulke before handing me my mail. And the socialist rabbi in Cape Town? He nearly fainted when I introduced myself. For him, Israel Zangwill was no less than the Jewish Dickens. But wait, there's more. In 1923, Izzy, as I call him, was voted, I kid you not, the third most outstanding Jew in the world. In the world. There was a contest, Compliments of the Jewish Times in Britain. They asked their readers to come up with a list of their top 12 Jews. Brilliant. Who doesn't love a list? But why 12? Well, why not? Maybe they thought, how about one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel? Or one for every month. Can you imagine the fundraising calendar? A whole year of outstanding Jews. Then something more amazing happened. On September 17th, 1923, Izzy graced the cover of Time magazine. Not the number 1 Jew, Albert Einstein, of course, or number 2, Chaim Weizmann, but number 3. Overnight, at least in America, Izzy's bronze medal was suddenly gold. And, let's be honest, isn't this one reason so many people search for their roots? To discover someone famous perched up in that family tree, to revel in a genetic link to celebrity? Well, that said, my connection to Izzy is, a little distant. Some kind of cousin, God only knows how many times removed. But distance, it only makes my heart grow fonder. I love that I share a bloodline with such a respected writer and wit and icing on the cake, feminist. Here's a guy who, in support of the female agitators of his day, 1907, said, and I quote, We shall not rest until this barbarous handicap of sex is wiped out from the statute books of civilization. Now, I realize that family lore is not what genealogists consider cold, hard evidence. For that, I count on my brother, who has spent years digging up proof of our kinship with Izzy. He writes endless letters, researches every mention, connects even the faintest of dots. But I have something that my brother does not. I have copies of letters written by the man himself. And they reveal some tantalizing, possibly DNA-based traits that we share. For instance, Izzy suffered from insomnia. I have insomnia. Izzy's close friend was Russian revolutionary Peter Kropotkin. Today forgotten, but not by me, I have schlepped my cherished copy of Kropotkin's memoirs with me everywhere for 45 years. Finally, Izzy was devoted to women's suffrage. Not to brag, but I always vote, every election, even local. Best, though, was who Izzy was writing to. Emma Goldman, anti-war radical, birth control pioneer, all-around rabble-rouser. I have claimed Emma as a spiritual foremother since the 1970s, inspired by her passion and her courage and her humor, and not least that no less than J. Edgar Hoover called her, and I quote again, the most dangerous woman in America. My treasured Emma-Izzy correspondence is for me a kind of familial beacon lighting my path. So I don't need to spit in a test tube. I already have the third most outstanding Jew nestled up with the most dangerous woman. With these two in my corner, well, you know, Ira Gershwin said it best. Who could ask for anything more?
Beth Kwon is going to open the second half. She is a writer and editor based here in New York City. She has served as communications director at Columbia University and Barnard College, and she's currently a speechwriter at NYU. She, too, is a former journalist, and she was an editor and writer at Women's Wear Daily and Newsweek, and among other outlets, her work has appeared in Allure, Time Out New York, The Village Voice, and Fortune. Beth also publishes a personal zine called BKNY, and for Beth, what's in a name is less of a question than a quest. And here to present the power of a name, please give a warm welcome back to Beth Kwon.
When I was young, I hated my last name, Kwon. People spelled it wrong. K-W-A-N. Q-U-A-N. People said it wrong. Quack. Known. Noke. As if the sight of a non-Anglo-Saxon name short-circuited their ability to read. Korean names are typically based on Chinese characters, and my dad told me our character meant power. It didn't feel powerful to me. I dreamed of one day marrying so I could abandon my name and adopt a better one. After college, I moved to South Korea to teach English to college students. There, upon learning my surname, they often said to me, "You must be an Andong Kwon." I learned that the Kwon line was one of the few that could be traced back to a single lineage, a clan from a village called Andong, 117 miles southeast of Seoul. It dates to the year 918 and the Korea Kingdom, upon which Korea's modern name is based. In my own family, we even had a physical book that dictated which names succeeding generations are supposed to give their kids to indicate the generation they belong to. But after my parents died and we cleared out the house, somehow the book disappeared. Still, the idea of being an Andong Kwon stuck with me. When I visited there, I saw that it was no longer tiny. Andong is now a bustling city and home to a folk village that's listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. There are houses with thatched roofs. Visitors can watch a Korean mask dance and try outdoor games like Nol Twigi, where participants jump on opposite ends of a seesaw and are propelled into the air by the force of their partner. Workers in traditional dress pound cooked rice with giant mallets to prepare rice cake treats. There is also a dish called andong chicken, where the meat is braised in soy sauce. My dad made it once when my mom was in the hospital recovering from surgery. It was the only time I remember seeing him cook anything other than ramen. I don't think he was caught up in its relation to our heritage, but was more attracted to the ease in preparation. My mother didn't seem to care so much about ancestry. Korea is an isolated peninsula, she would say. Everyone's related to each other. I also got the feeling that digging into our past would be a betrayal. Our family history was troubled, with illicit affairs and a child born to a mistress. There was a sense that life for my parents began when they immigrated to the US in the 1960s as young adults. My dad was talkative and my mother was more reticent, but details of their prior lives surfaced in offhand comments, not as treasured memories, but as bits of a past that my parents seemed to feel didn't matter. I lived in Korea for 2 years, and I did meet other Kwons, including distant relatives. One was an elderly uncle, several times removed, who would sit cross-legged on the floor doing traditional Korean calligraphy while farting. My dad told me he was one of the most esteemed calligraphists in the country. I eventually moved back to the US and became a journalist. Even though there are many well-known Kwons, including K-pop and K-drama stars, athletes, scholars, and artists, people still mangle my name. It's a surname for people of Chinese descent, too, like Michelle Kwon, the Olympic ice skater. I wouldn't expect to talk to any random Kwon I met and assume we are kin. In the meantime, my fantasy of relinquishing my last name has long faded. Over the years, I became attached to my writer's byline and grew to see my name, Beth Kwon, as indeed powerful. Now, I ignore people who mess up my name. I did marry, but I kept my surname, and I gave it to my kids, too. I also make andong chicken for them regularly. And when we finally make that trip to the old-fashioned folk village in Andong, Korea, we can all be proud of how our name carries our background and identity.
Raised in Norfolk, Virginia, Sharon Forman is a Reform rabbi and longtime Jewish educator. These twin passions often find expression in the many essays and stories she's published online and in print. She's also a playwright, and her work, entitled Elisheva, was recently produced by the Jewish Theater of Oklahoma. Sharon's explorations in unexpected corners of Judaism also include her own take on baseball, and she has single-handedly enlivened our national pastime with her Baseball Haggadah, a festival of freedom and springtime in 15 innings. In addition to cheering on her favorite athletes, Sharon also coaches a steady stream of bar and bat mitzvah students from her home in Westchester, where she lives with her husband and 3 sons. Sharon's hobby, discovering genetic kin through DNA testing, is a bit of a ruse, a cover for her real goal, which is to go where no woman has gone before. Here to present her story, In Search of Captain Kirk, please welcome Sharon Forman.
Each month, I receive a present in the form of an email from 23andMe, advising me about newly tested relatives who share my DNA segments. 4 years ago, when I filled a plastic container with spit, I never imagined I would gain access to 1,505 close and distant relatives, more than enough people to fill an average-sized Broadway theater 3 times over. Unlike some individuals whose lives churned in turmoil after unearthing startling biological information. I found my 96.9% Eastern European Jewish genetic breakdown to be utterly predictable. Other than a recent revelation that just a drop of North African, Cypriot, and Levantine blood runs in my veins, my findings explained why I remind so many Jewish people of their cousin Rachel. I pretty much am their cousin Rachel with a different biblical first name. Each month, however, my heart races just a bit when I open that email with a list of human beings who carry fragments of common ancestors inside of their cells. My scientist sister cautions me not to get too wrapped up in some romantic notion of blood relatives, as all humans have nearly identical DNA. We are not only closely related to chimpanzees, but also are distant cousins of mold. In my heart, I am certain that love makes a family, not RNA. And yet, I am intrigued about the identities behind these new names or initials that pop up on my screen at the end of each month. Perhaps I am related to a world-famous pianist, a Major League Baseball player, the inventor of the artificial pancreas, or the baker who created the Nutella croissant donut hybrid. Over time, I have developed a system for establishing my relationship with these newest relatives. First, I scan through the list of last names to find any familiar family members. This almost never happens. Once, Google revealed that one of my new relatives shared a name with either the toe wrestling world champion or an attorney. I discovered a third cousin whose profession was competitive eater. Perhaps there's a gene segment for possible employment in the circus. A powerful motivation for looking so carefully each month at my DNA list is that I am in search of Captain Kirk. I'm not even much of a Star Trek fan, and my relatives resemble the actor who played Mr. Spock much more than Blue-Eyed Kirk. But I have a deep emotional hunch that William Shatner, the Canadian Jewish actor who portrayed Captain James T. Kirk, and I are mishpacha, the Hebrew and Yiddish word for family. Each month, I diligently hunt for WS on my list to confirm my suspicion. But so far, Kirk remains elusive. A few years ago, one of my son's classmates' unusual last name popped up under new relatives. After a quick consultation with a dear friend, who is the veritable Kevin Bacon of our small suburb, we confirmed that this newly revealed second or third cousin was indeed the grandmother of my son's friend. "Welcome to the fold," my new cousin wrote to me in a gracious email. We agreed that the children may not wish to go to prom together in the future. The webs of connection, both real and imagined, tie us to our neighbors, our friends, and our family. Every 30 days or so, I will keep on hunting for WS to show up on my relatives list. As we still suffer from the fear and fallout from our global pandemic, the possibility of connecting with Captain Kirk reminds me that the universe is more intimate and vaster than we can imagine. I, like him, am connected to worlds that are far away, in which time folds before and after us. I will be bold.
So the very idea that we share DNA with mold, that there's one of my favorite pieces. I include some. Really to fill some column here in the program, I like to include some quotes that relate to the topic. And my favorite this time is that one from Robert Anton Wilson, who said, "Most of our ancestors were not perfect, ladies and gentlemen. The majority of them weren't even mammals." So, ever since his first publication in his junior high school yearbook, Henry Torres has been a poet. Born and raised in New York City's Lower East Side among his 5 siblings, Henry received his master's degree from Columbia Teachers College, and his career spanned 33 years, including teaching social studies at IS 162 in the South Bronx. Henry is delighted to have published a book of poems entitled Dustings, but truth be told, he is just as quick to tell you about his 2 daughters, of whom he is exceptionally proud. In his essay, Oh, That Tree, Henry tells of his mysterious uncle and namesake, whose generosity was the stuff of legend in both Puerto Rico and New York. Please give a warm welcome to Henry Torres.
When my Uncle Quique came from Puerto Rico, it felt like a full-fledged visit from a full-fledged celebrity, that is. My brother, 3 sisters, and I were assigned to clean the house, a 5-room project apartment. We scoured and scrubbed it spick and span. On the day of the big arrival, my parents instructed us to dress up in our church clothes, and then drove off to Idlewild to greet the special guests. My excitement was tinged with dread that we might not meet our uncle's high expectations of Lower East Side children. He was a native Puerto Rican coming to the largest urban setting in the mainland. We did not want to disappoint. We sat by the windows facing the parking area, waiting for the big arrival. When our used beige Oldsmobile pulled up, my parents got out. Then came Uncle Quique. He was over 6 feet tall and corpulent. He had a crew cut, a black suit, white shirt, brown bow tie. To us, he looked like a statesman. Our nervousness bordered on hysteria as he lifted his enormous suitcase and strode towards our building. Then the grand entrance. Mommy and Papi opened the door to escort him in. Mommy whispered to us to go to our rooms to wait. After his large frame was situated on the rocking chair in the living room, everyone's favorite chair, my parents called out for us. We were instructed to line up in age order. Being the youngest, I was at the head of the line. There was a silence while we stood erect and looked straight ahead like the Von Trapps. We knew Uncle Quique had once been mayor of a town in Puerto Rico, and it had been hinted that he was a Freemason and had come to New York City on a first stop to an all-important Chicago meeting. We weren't sure what a Freemason was, but clearly Uncle Quique was a somebody. In a deep and startling, booming voice, he told us how happy he was to meet all 5 of us together. Then he told us about the money tree in his backyard in Puerto Rico. He wanted to share some of its fruit. From an expensive-looking black zip leather bag, he removed 5 change purses. He distributed them ceremonially, one at a time, as he walked down the line. Since I was the youngest, mine had the least money. 50 cents, a quarter, 2 Liberty dimes, and an Indian head nickel. It felt like a fortune. My brother and I bunked in with our sisters so that the important visitor could stay in our room. When my uncle went to bed, we were told to be quiet as mice. but his snoring made that impossible. The cement walls reverberated. It was like logs being sawed by sleeping characters in Saturday morning cartoons. We couldn't help laughing out loud. Since I was named after him, I was expected to show a bit more adoration. That was easy, and I exhibited unimpeachable behavior to him. He was like a king holding court, and it made our home and us feel special. Before leaving for Chicago, he bestowed on our modest apartment the gift of a brand new washing machine. One of my most cherished dreams was to go to his backyard to see his money tree. Then, with his permission, I would climb up high to pull off some of its bills. Years later, after he had passed away, I visited his native town, Vega Baja. In the museum of the town's history, I found myself transported to another time and place. On the wall in the mayor's room is a photo of Uncle Kike. I had seen that photo before in a family album. I found no tree, but there had been once. I felt sure. I wondered where it might have stood.
Our next writer, Ann Casapini, is something of an expert when it comes to the mind-body connection, and that's thanks in no small part to both yoga and meditation, both of which she teaches. Ann's other creative passions can be a bit more, well, noisy, because she loves to sing and salsa dance, and of course writing spans all her interests. Ann is widely published in such places as Intima, a journal of narrative medicine, and anthologized in Fiction International, Crack the Spine, and Still Point Arts Quarterly, among others. She's also been a finalist and received an honorable mention for some of her flash fiction. She lives in Tuckahoe, New York, with her husband, son, and dog, Rocky, and returns to our stage today with Maria, Born in Grace. Please say hello to Ann Casapini.
I am 16 at my grandmother's for dinner with my Colombian relatives. We call her Mama Abuela. She lives in an old Upper West Side apartment on 181st Street in Manhattan. In her large living room are 3 unmatched couches covered in plastic, tall, gaudy brass lamps, and recuerdos de Bogotá sitting on each of the crowded shelves. Tacked to the wall above the TV and under a large crucifix are Technicolor postcards of the Church of Monserrate, the Salt Cathedral Zipaquirá, and the Gold Museum, Museo del Oro. Plastic folding tables have been opened and covered in Mama Abuela's hand-embroidered tablecloths for the occasion. I am trying to understand the various Spanish conversations going on, but I only get about a third of what's being said. The little Spanish I know was learned during a summer spent in Bogotá when I was 5. Today, I wonder, who am I? Do I belong here? Or am I gringa? My immediate family and I live in a small house in Oceanside, Long Island. Besides my mother, there are no other Latin people in our neighborhood. My mother, Isadora, was born in Colombia, my father, Giovanni, in northern Italy. I am first-generation American. Dad was very proud of being an American citizen. He was so proud of his English, he wouldn't speak Italian to me or my siblings, and he didn't allow my mother to speak any Spanish. Now, as I gaze at my grandmother, Maria Engracia Tovar Sandoval, I see for the first time how her flared nostrils and down-turned lips, olive skin, and brown eyes contrast my fair skin and blue eyes. Mama Abuela is short and round and wears her long gray hair in a tight, low bun. She always wears dresses, never pants. Her extra-large breasts make for soft, sweet hugs, which she bestows on me whenever she can. Her deep cleavage is also a convenient pocket for eyeglasses, rolled up single dollar bills, and her constantly squealing hearing device. My grandmother speaks no English at all, having arrived in the US when she was already over 60. In her new neighborhood, Washington Heights, everyone speaks Spanish, so she doesn't need to learn. She can go downstairs to the groceria on Fort Washington Avenue and buy aguacate and plátanos whenever she'd like. In Oceanside, where I live, people rarely eat avocados, and no one even knows what plantains are. Now the smell of Mama Abuela's cooking is now wafting into the living room. She has made a typical Colombian meal called bandeja paisa in her tiny galley kitchen. Steak, rice, fried eggs, pork chicharron, avocado, beans, sausage, plantains, and my favorite, arepas. White corn cakes stuffed with cheese. When eaten fresh, they melt in my mouth. So around the table sit my aunts, Tia Mercedes, Tia Romelia, and my uncles, Tio Pablo, Tio Jorge, Tio Francisco. Tio Jorge loves music so much, he always has cumbia playing on his tape deck. Cousins Bertica and Fernando are dancing. When I visit my relatives, my friends' relatives. When I visit my friends' relatives, I hear only Perry Como and Frank Sinatra, and no one ever dances. I wonder what my Long Island friends would think if they were here with me today. When it's time for café and dessert, I help bring out the torta de tres leches, a vanilla cake bathed in condensed milk, cream, and evaporated milk. Then we begin to play trabalenguas, tongue twisters. En tres tristes trastos de trigo, tres tristes tigres comían trigo, tres tristes tigres, and tres tristes tigres. I don't understand all the words. But I realize I don't have to understand because everyone, including me, is laughing so hard. Today, for the first time, I really see my Latino family and embrace my heritage. I feel lucky. I feel special. I see our similarities more than our differences. And I understand that sharing food and laughter and love is our universal language. And I decide to study Spanish.
Born and raised as a proud Cleveland native, Isaiah Hunt focuses on near-future stories of his community, the entertainment industry, and transhumanist capitalism. When he's not fiddling around with music or studying Pan-African history, he's daydreaming of worlds adjacent to our own. He's recently earned his MFA in creative writing and is a Hopkins Fellow for John Carroll University, where he currently teaches fiction writing. His work can be found at the Wick Poetry Center, Luna Negra, On the Run, and elsewhere. For Isaiah, the earth itself, its minerals, ores, and rocks are much more than metaphoric when he investigates his own family history in My Story, My Metallurgy. Isaiah traveled from Kent, Ohio to appear on our stage this afternoon and therefore wins today's longest commute honors. Please say hello to Isaiah Hunt.
My ancestors were superheroes off the coast of West Africa who maintained a ritual kinship with rock and ore. The Igbo, Earth's first Iron Man, flourished within their forges. Each strike of a blacksmith's otutu onto his ihiwama was akin to drum patterns used to invoke their supreme being, Chokwu, for protection as strong as steel. However, any metal unprayed for is an Igbo's kryptonite. Colonization brought ships full of shackles and chains, cursed with unholy power, to shatter families and untether traditions. Thousands of Igbo tossed themselves overboard to return their souls home. My ancestors endured the harsh voyage. I imagine my ancestors arriving in Virginia from the Calvin Presley slave ship, hearing the land's too, pleading for salvation. Probably why my great-great-grandfather chose to be a vigilante in the depths of Alabama. Poisoned by alcohol and the remnants of slavery, he wasn't a perfect man. Some might call him a murderer, others a hero. Regardless, the incident might have happened at a bar where a white man baited him with slurs and threats. My great-great-grandfather clutched the hilt of his knife or gripped the metal of his gun like gums to a tooth. I imagine the anger of my ancestors charged that bullet or ignited the fury within that knife, its iron-sharp tip whispering, "I hear you." And avoiding nooses and burning crosses to flee north with his family, he permitted my great-grandmother to step outside of her house, the first black family in East Cleveland, Ohio, to sip the stable suburban life. One of her daughters is my grandmother, with skin as beautiful and brown as the wood my ancestors blessed before burning it into charcoal. She met a man at a carnival whose voice was as warm and electrifying as sparks from an anvil. I imagine them 200 feet high on a Ferris wheel, the closest my blood has reached for the stars, farthest from the threats of a white man's tongue, a chance to feel American, even if briefly for this ride, wishing for a peaceful future to raise a daughter and son. But that hope faded when he won the lottery. Congratulations, number 148. It's time to serve your country. His prize, a free ticket to Vietnam, a land thick with rice fields, Agent Orange, and the supposed communism that antagonizes the American dream. Even my ancestors could not shield him from witnessing the worst humanity has to offer. He left his country, a malleable man of steel, returned a veteran, bruised, battered, beaten. His final reward from his country was an asylum where a pipe bomb finished what war could not. And my mother, a decade under the sun, listened intently in her classroom as the teacher nonchalantly read off each victim's name in the morning newspaper as if it were a simple shopping list. My mother didn't raise her hand. She did not cry. Calmly, she laid her number 2 pencil down, approached the teacher, and whispered, "That's my father." When her mother, too, was prepared to meet death, doctors predicted a matter of months, my mother's powers had finally awoken. She invoked Chokwu within her DNA, praying over the tubes and ports of the tomotherapy machine to negate the poison festering in her mother's flesh. She was not ready to lose another parent. So when doctors found no trace of my grandmother's cancer, they attributed it to a miracle. And while I don't have the superpowers to smith, protect, or heal, my ancestors, my mother, bestowed upon me the gift to tell their stories. My stories are my hammer to the anvil. My words reconnect with the forgotten. I am the reparations of Igbo ancestors lost to colonization, slavery, and time. My pencil is my Otutu, my page, my Ihuama, my stories, my metallurgy.
In the summer of 2020, Natasha Williams took a slight professional detour to attend the Breadloaf School of English, and thus the professor became a student. Excerpts of her memoir, The Part of Him I Kept, have appeared in several journals and reflect more often than not her tendency toward both detached humor and not so detached nostalgia. Natasha lives in the Hudson Valley, where she teaches biology at SUNY Ulster, and she coaches science teachers through the International Public School Network. In closing our show today, Natasha shares the startling and deep connection to family that she discovered in the mountains I belong to. Please give a very warm welcome back to Natasha Williams. Please stand by.
Thank you. I met my husband at a birthday party of an old college flame on a night I was heading somewhere else. He was a bellhop at the time and stood out in his work clothes after a late shift at Mohonk Mountain House. If I hadn't gone, and if I hadn't inexplicably stayed at a party full of strangers, longer than I'd planned, I never likely would have met Ken or made the Hudson Valley my home. What I didn't know was an ancestral calling was in play. The Hudson Valley began as a river delta 350 million years ago. 150 million years later, continental drift pushed up the Appalachians, and the delta rose almost uniformly into a plateau. Over time, streams carved gaps and valleys, leaving today's Catskill Mountains, mountains that aren't officially mountains since they didn't form from the pushing up of the Earth's crust, but instead were shaped by the long arc of flux and time. I, too, was shaped by forces bigger than me or my family could contain. My father's schizophrenia, a floodplain that swept us up, ephemeral forces that called my father to a mission from God and shaped our world. The isolation of his living room vocation posed such profound questions about his place in the world and, by proxy, my sense of belonging. To begin with, I was one of those babies who probably wasn't held enough, and so was happy in anyone's arms. But I felt more like a guest with the families that fostered me in the urban landscape of my youth than part of the fabric of the community. And then I met Ken. On our first date, he caught me in the turnstiles of the train and made me promise to see him again. His certainty that we belonged together was an eddy that drew me in. But we didn't stay put. We moved 6 times in 10 years. And as a serial newcomer, I never put down roots. When we moved to the Hudson Valley, it was a compromise move, the place my husband felt most at home, and for me, close enough to New York City. Our daughters were school age, and we came intending to stay. After 20 years of shopping at the same markets, countless school recitals, and civic work in Marbletown, New York, I realized I have lived in this place longer than I have ever lived anywhere. Then this past year, after reading letters between my grandparents, I was astonished to learn that my mother's family sailed from the Netherlands in 1659 to this very town. In fact, Brink Farm Road, which is directly over the hill from my house, was the homestead of my 2 grand aunts who came to Marbletown hundreds of years ago. Cottekill, our hamlet, is Dutch for the stream that flows past our road, a waterway fed by a river that flows from where my husband was raised in Sussex County, New Jersey. The course of our life together had brought me back to the very land of my mother's people. After so many years of feeling like I didn't belong, I found myself on land that only the Lenape people had been on longer than my ancestors. The Davenports had nothing on us. Like an ephemeral call, serendipity called me back to the mountains I belonged to, and I'm grateful to a father who showed me how to pay attention to the signs. Thank you.
Stay put. Stay put. Will all the writers come up and join me? Let's have the writers up here, everybody. We've built Read 650 around live performances like this one, and I'm so proud to be here with this group of fine writers, and proud of what a small group of committed volunteers can really create. And continues to build with me. As I explained earlier, there's lots of moving parts to this organization, and we have room and need for volunteers and board members, especially in the areas of marketing and finance. So if you have any room or time for board service or to volunteer or to be part of what we're doing to help us grow, please do reach out if you'd like to discuss. You can always reach me with thoughts or suggestions via email at read650.org. I hope you will follow the podcast and allow us to stay in touch by joining our mailing list. And you can do that, as I said, at the bottom of any page on our website. Please also don't leave your programs here. Take them home with you. Pass them on to one writer you know. That will be a tremendous bit of outreach for us and help get the word out. In Swahili, there is a well-loved phrase, tuko pamoja, which translates as we are together. And it's what my friends and I often say when we raise a glass in a toast. And though there are many issues that divide us and divide our world right now, all of us in this room are united in our love for stories and for the spoken word. And so I say tuko pamoja to you. I ask you to say it back, tuko pamoja. Thank you. And in my heart, I am grateful for all your support. We can't do what we do without you. And this round of applause from us is for all of you. And please don't rush off while there's still wine to drink and people to meet. We've got some cheese, some things out in the gallery for the meet and greet. And if you enjoyed yourself today, please do tell your friends about us. And now we're going to do this one last thing that we haven't rehearsed. We're going to do a bow. Hold on. All right. In 3, 2, 1, down we go. We'll do it again. One more. Thank you. Thank you.